Do you have a child that's over the age of 18, or you are that child over the age of 18 that would have qualified for a CRBA if the parents only filed on time, or if they actually knew that they could get a CRBA for the child? Well, in this video, I'm going to talk about what that child can do now that they're already over the age of 18 to still get proof that they are a US citizen. I am US immigration attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the US immigration law system. Now, I see this a lot where parents of kids that are born outside of the US may not even know that there's a process other than an I-130 and green card process to bring that child to the US, or the parents have decided not to bring the child to the US. However, they did not know that they could still give citizenship to that child, or at least get proof that that child is a US citizen. So then they end up not having anything. They grow up not knowing that they could get a US passport and just travel to the US whenever they want. They go through life not knowing this. Well, let's break that cycle with this video, okay? So if you are the US citizen parent or the child of a US citizen and you want to know if your child or yourself still qualify to get proof of your citizenship, even though you're too old to get a CRBA, well, let's talk about it. Now, before we get into how to actually do this, let's talk about the requirements for the CRBA. Because in order to do the next thing that will actually get you proof of your citizenship, you have to do this first, okay? You have to make sure that you meet the CRBA requirements and that you have the documentation to show that you meet the CRBA requirements. To qualify for a CRBA, you have to prove the following. First, the child was born outside of the US. Secondly, the US citizen parent has to have been a US citizen before the child was born, either by birth or by naturalization. Third, that US citizen parent has to show that they have had physical presence in the US for 5 years before that child was born. And that can be 5 years at a time, 5 years in aggregate, meaning over time. So even if they spend a few months here in the US and then the rest of the time outside of the US, you want to add up all the time they were physically in the US with proof of those times that they were physically in the US in order to show the 5 years, okay? And 2 of those 5 years has to be after that parent, that's a US citizen, turned 14. So 2 of them has to be after the age of 14. Now, if the child is under the age of 18 and they meet all of these requirements, the next process would be to apply for a consular report of birth abroad through the US Embassy. But that's not why we're here. I have a whole video on the CRBA, so feel free to watch that if that's your situation. But for people that already missed that deadline of filing before the child is 18, stay with me. Now, you already went through that process. You know you could have qualified for a CRBA, but for the fact that you are already 18 or the child is already 18, what can you do to give citizenship to that child to show that you are a US citizen, even though you don't have a CRBA? Well, you need to gather all the evidence that shows that you meet the requirements for the CRBA. And then you need to apply for a US passport at a US embassy where you live. Again, this is something that people don't think about or know about. The US embassy does not really, advertise this to everyone. If you go looking for it, you will find it. However, it is not obvious that this is a way that you can show your citizenship. So, first, figure out if you qualify for CRBA. Second, get every single documentation you can to prove that you qualify for the CRBA. And then thirdly, apply for a US passport at a US embassy. The reason you want to apply for a US passport at the US embassy is that a US passport is proof of your citizenship. Just like a consular report of birth abroad, the CRBA is proof of citizenship. Okay? So you are now looking for proof of your citizenship because, again, you are already a US citizen. We just need to prove it. Okay? So you apply for your US passport using the form DS-11 and you bring all the supporting documents for that CRBA, even though you are not applying for a CRBA, right? So you go to your interview, you bring all the documents, the officer is going to look at it and determine if you actually meet the requirements. And if you do, guess what? The officer is going to approve your US passport, which means you now have proof of your US citizenship and you can now travel in and out of the US like the US citizen you are. Okay? Now, there's an additional step that I would want you to do. Okay? You can't stop at just having your US passport and, when it expires, you go and renew it. But I want you to take an extra step, right? That extra step takes place when you finally decide to come to the US. If you travel into the US, you can apply for a Certificate of Citizenship. That's the N600. So you would apply for that using the same documentation that you use to apply for your US passport to show that you were a US citizen at birth. So you apply for an N600, you get your Certificate of Citizenship. Now you're good. Okay? Now you're good. But let me explain why you want to do that extra step, because a lot of people stop at the passport and just leave it at that. But I always recommend the extra step for this reason. When you apply for a US passport and you get it, that's with the State Department. The Department of Homeland Security has no records of you being a US citizen. When the Social Security Administration goes to issue a Social Security card, they're pulling information from the Department of Homeland Security. Okay? So they are not going to automatically know that you're a US citizen because there's no records with the Department of Homeland Security. Do you get me? So you want to make sure that you are taking every single step to have as many documentation that prove that you're a US citizen as possible. Also, if your US citizen passport, if your US passport expires or goes missing, guess what? You remember all the document you had to show the first time to get that first US passport? An officer can make you show them all that documentation again. So every single time you go to apply for a US passport, you have to prove that you're a US citizen every single time. But if you have a certificate of citizenship, all you would have to do is provide your certificate of citizenship as your proof of citizenship. Okay, you don't have to, bring 5 years of residence for your parents every single time you go to apply for a US passport. It saves you time, it saves you effort, and it solidifies your citizenship even without your passport. Once your passport goes missing, you no longer have proof of your citizenship. Okay, you no longer have proof. However, with a certificate of citizenship, now you can use that to show that you're still a US citizen. Or you can always rely on DHS to issue you a replacement of your certificate of citizenship if you lose that as well, which, again, you don't need to show all of that documentation about your parents because they would already have it and be able to just issue you a replacement. So that's how you can still have proof that you are a US citizen at birth, even if you missed the deadline to apply for a consular report of birth abroad, a CRBA, with the US Embassy. So if you are a US citizen and you are watching this and you're like, I need to do this for my child, or you are that child and you need to do this feel free to reach out to our office if you have any questions or if you would like help with the process. If you would like to schedule that strategy session, it is a free 15-minute session where we talk about your situation. You can do that by going to my website, lilylegal.com, and clicking on Contact Us, where you can pick a date and time that works best for you for us to talk about your case.